affording in my eye. Mojana na na num shegu na de tu ho my eye. Edumene was so.
We welcome all of you to this Twitter space. It's been 32 minutes late, better late than never. So far, I see about 7 of the speakers on. So let me just be sure they can hear me and we can hear them. Bright Simmons, if you are on, if you can just say hello.
Hello, Bernard.
It's good to have you from whichever part of the world you are. Theo, it's good to have you. I guess you're in the UK.
Yes, I am.
Wonderful. Professor Abuna Odro, thank you for joining. If you can say hello.
Hello.
Wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Josephine Baku-Amponsa, I see you are on. Hello.
Hello, Bernard.
It's good to have you. I'm not sure if Dr. Emmanuel Kujo is on as a speaker yet. Dr. Kujo, can you hear me? Still connecting. Okay. What about Professor Butexen? If you are on, can you say hello? Not yet. Professor Jepon Majekiadako, are you on? All right. I guess we have a quorum because at least we have Theo, we have Bright, we have Professor Odro and myself. That's 4. There were 8 speakers, so that's half. It's a very important topic because when the crisis occurs, people think, right? And the crisis that started manifesting in July 2022 is really symptomatic of what we've been going through in cycles. I think it was Bright Simmons who posted a few months ago the number of shocks we've had in the economy. And I think every 4 years there's a shock, whether it's cocoa price or gold price or energy crisis or portfolio investors taking their money out of the economy. I think the main point is that our economy is not resilient enough, is not diversified enough, because we face problems that most countries in the global south face, which is a problem of an economy that is inherently weak, an economy that is not monetarily sovereign. By that I mean, yes, you can print your own currency, but there's a limit to how you can do this. You borrow a lot of money. External debt is high, possibly because you import a lot of the important things. For example, Ghana, you import your food. The food import bill 2021 was $2 billion. You import fossil fuels to power your electricity, even though you have renewables. So those are, you depend on foreign currency to feed yourself and to power your country. And then your productive capacity is low, so you export raw materials, whether it's cocoa in raw form or gold in raw form or crude oil, and you import finished products. So those 3 combinations of importing food, importing energy, fossil fuels particularly, and then a sort of a weak industrial capacity, they conspire to make you a country that really depends on the dollar. And that artificial approach you use to stabilize your currency doesn't really help you. So your central bank is always looking for dollars to stabilize the cedi, and your cedi has been falling since record started, redenomination notwithstanding. So I think the problem is that over the long term, we've not found a way to be food sovereign, I believe, and energy sovereign in a way that reduces your dependency on the dollar. I mean, if you are Japan or UK or US, you can print any amount of money you want and you can do anything you like because you don't really need to have external debt that much, right? But in Ghana, your currency is weak. And like many countries in the south, you are not really in charge of your economy. Your approach of trying to bring FDI or attracting multinationals doesn't really help because every first quarter they repatriate their profits. FDI is never anywhere near enough. You give them a lot of subsidies in power. So the model is not working, right? And we know it's because we are in a rut. So debt crisis in the 80s, neoliberal economic policies, SAP, it doesn't really work. Couple that with corruption, 4-year election cycles, and the rest of it, you have bad economic management compounding an already bad problem, right? So in my view, it's almost like you're in a cycle that you can't change. And the difficult things you need to do to change it, your politics doesn't allow you to do it. Right. And then, yeah, so I think that's what it is. Economic model that's not based on real value addition. We are doing too much grammar education. We're not doing enough technical and vocational education to power some industrialization, which is based on better production. And then your politics just worsens everything, right? So having interviewed all finance ministers since, I don't know, before, I get the sense they deeply understand the problem. The commitment within their parties to do it is not there. So they basically do as little as they can to either just win the next election or to get as much money for themselves as they can. And then the thing keeps it's like a race to the bottom. So I don't know. So that's the moderator or the guest moderator's view. I don't know who wants to go next. I've spent 5 minutes already. So maybe let me go to Bright. Bright, can you tidy up where I've come from? It's a very pessimistic opening, but you've tidied it up for me.
As we recall, Bernard, you wanted Professor Bernard Drew to go after you.
Okay. Prof, since you taught me international economics and I passed, if I made any mistake, you correct it. So, Prof, you have the floor. How come our economy is in such a rut over the past 65 years?
Okay, I was in and out, so I didn't hear everything that was said. And just to let you know that I have Dr. Kujo with me in my office, so we're going to be
Wonderful.
doing this together. So why is our economy in a rut after 65 years? Let us remember as we conduct our discussions that the legacy of colonialism has not been shaken off. And at independence, we had a number of disadvantages in terms of economic infrastructure, social infrastructure, etc. And these are things that we've had to address in terms of correcting for the maladjustment of our economy. We've had to work to address these in the last 65 years. I think you mentioned one of the challenges when I was connected, and that is the vulnerability of the economy, where we still have three commodities, gold, cocoa, and oil, accounting for 70% thereabouts of our export earnings in terms of merchandise exports. And so anytime prices of these commodities take a dive, then you find that it impacts adversely on our balance of payments. Another challenge that we have, despite the fact that we have improved upon our levels of education and to some extent our levels of skills, is that we haven't made significant strides in improving labor productivity. And in an economy, especially in the last, you could say 30 years, we've taken the approach of an open economy, which means that we are now subject to a lot of competition in the production of goods and services. And we need to have a skilled labor force, a productive labor force, to be able to compete on the world market and to be able to compete at home with the imports that flood into the market. And then another challenge, which I think we are all well aware of, is we haven't made progress in creating jobs. And not just any job, but in creating decent jobs. To some extent, that's also linked to the issue of labor productivity. So for a start, these are some of the challenges or the areas in which we fail to make progress and why we are where we are today.
Wonderful. Thank you. So colonialism, maladjustments, vulnerability, low labor productivity, not enough jobs, and the economy too open. So that's a lot to go with. Since Dr. Kujo is with you, Doc, can you add a bit more? We are breaking the discussion into two. One is how we got here, and then part two is how we get out of here. So anything to add or any elaborations on how our economy after 60 something years is fragile and really not resilient and not bringing development?
Well, thank you very much. And I won't elaborate on a lot of what Prof. Odro had just said. Only to add that in a couple of areas, particularly in agriculture, where we could potentially have invested significant amounts of infrastructure which would transform it in a way that increases productivity and also provides not just jobs, but also the potential to expand on our exports, especially in areas such as grain, are things that we haven't really done much. Because I think the reasons why we haven't really moved so far after 60 or 70 years, and I like to take the 70-year time period because a lot of the planning started somewhere in 1951, 52. So if you look at it from that perspective, that gives you a fairly long period to think about how the economy is really being structured. And I think that's where we are lacking and have lacked. And despite more recent attempts to improve on agriculture, these haven't been properly done. And I think tying it to the agricultural issue is the development of low-tech industrial capacity, because I think we usually have tended to think of very high-tech, high-end industrial capabilities. But these things take time precisely because they are all linked not just to the development of agriculture in a way, but also to the quality of the labor force that is created by the labor market, but also by the educational system, which then provides the leverage for further development and change. And I think these are the two areas that I would touch on for now. I'm sure when as the conversation goes on, a few more would come up, yes. And if you have questions, you can ask, yes.
Thank you. So, Bright, I know you don't like coming in early, but I feel like you need to tell us what you think the problem is, in addition to what has been said already.
Can you hear me, Bernard?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much. So, this is an exciting debate, and I'm very grateful to Charlene and the team at Asset for putting it together. My opening remarks are that primarily the problem is threefold. First, as far as I'm concerned, there's been a fundamental misdiagnosis of economic conditions for a very long time. And this has been caused by a very weak policy debate environment in which very few competing schools of thought really exist, and where it doesn't really matter very much if policy prescriptions are got wrong. So in that sense, you have a situation where we really don't take policy very seriously. So people don't say, okay, here is my proposal for how to get irrigation right. And another school says, no, this is my set of, or this is our set of ideas. And then 3 years down the line, somebody does a review and realizes, oh no, this particular set of ideas were superior, and perhaps we should have followed the lead of that particular school of thought. So it led to a situation where we have very little high-stakes debate in policy in Ghana. So that's number one. Number two is that there's been a complete vacation of responsibility among elites to band together to really force governance. And the kind of economic governance I'm talking about is one where policy really matters. So there's an actual strong debate about how you should do one district, one factory, for instance. What should be the mechanics? And a group of people using both conceptual and empirical methods prove that a particular set of allocations are more likely to be effective. Should we do more agro processing? Should we, spend as much as we spent in Ghana on automotive development? Is it sensible, the number of concessions we've given to automotive developers in Ghana? I see none of that. I don't know any single country in the world where there is serious progress, where there is no high-stakes debate about allocation of resources and about the nature of government policy. So that's number two, the vacation of responsibility by elites. The third problem, and that is a natural consequence of the first two, is that we've created a situation where the government is spread very thin, because two issues have emerged from the first two that I pointed out. One is that there are no trade-offs because all the policies are fine. So the government is implementing hundreds and hundreds of policies. Nobody has a clue which is superior. Nobody has a clue who should pay the price if policy prescriptions are wrong. No mechanism exists to determine what the trade-offs should be. Should we do less 1D, 1F and more planting for food and jobs? Which elements of planting for food and jobs and why? Should we focus more on crops or should we focus more on livestock? I don't see that. Now, in the absence of high-stakes debate, in the absence of high-stakes trade-offs, every policy is possible, which is why we have so many ministries, all of them charged with policy and implementing so many programs and projects and spending so much money within our limited means, and why the selection is so poor. Now, why selection is so poor, one of the things you miss out is on identifying trade-offs that are highly lopsided. What do I mean? There's a fundamental assumption which is clearly flawed in our policy environment that you can find Pareto optimality everywhere. What do I mean by that? That you can find programs that makes everybody in Ghana well off and nobody to nobody's detriment, and that you can spend money on any number of projects and you will not necessarily see a decline in output in any sector. So in absence of trade-offs, any project is fine so long as it sounds plausible. So if tomorrow we should subsidize fuel, that's fine. If the next day we should take that money off and put it into Kelny GVG and monitor telecom revenues, that's fine. Everything goes really. And in that situation, you create difficult confusions that over time makes the entire policy program itself discordant and completely incoherent. I will illustrate that with our industrialization policy very quickly. One of the debates that I've had, and often it's not a real debate, it's just general, shallow, high-level conversations that I often hear on radio typically, is that we should industrialize. And often I'm not too clear what we mean by that, because when you look at industrialization at a very high level in Ghana, we are doing fairly well. We have almost 30% of GDP output is industrialization. Comparatively, it's 8.6% in the United Kingdom. It's about 11% in the US. It's maybe 13% thereabout in India. China is an outlier, but even China is around 26%, having dropped from about 40% in 1980. If you go to Germany, the industrial powerhouse, the share of manufacturing in GDP is around less than 20%. So in that sense, we are doing better than Germany. But of course, all of us know that cannot be true. You need to break it down to a certain degree of detail to understand what we really mean when we say we are not industrializing well. The second element about industrialization is the sheer percentage of the workforce in industrialization is not as bad as it looks. So when we say we should create manufacturing jobs, the fact of the matter is that the manufacturing sector, apart from constituting about 62% of total capital formation in the economy, so essentially most of our real hard assets are in manufacturing. We also have manufacturing being the number three employer in the country, and compared to places like the US, where share of manufacturing contribution to jobs is less than 10%. In our case, it's over 20%. So it's clearly not the high level. It's clearly something else within manufacturing and industrialization that we've got wrong. And if you were, and I don't have time to, of course, delve into this angle, but if you were to look at it very closely and to peel the surface off and try and delve into it, it appears the challenge has been that manufacturing does not link well with the rest of the sectors. So a very easy way to conceptualize this, to think about the production of mechanized equipment for agricultural purposes. Professor earlier speaker mentioned the fact that we don't do low technology, and so use an example, low tech implements for agriculture. If the manufacturing sector that you have does not produce enough of those kinds of implements, then naturally it doesn't matter how well you're doing manufacturing. In our case, we are stagnant. We've been stagnant for about a decade in terms of our manufacturing's contribution to both employment and GDP output. But if the type of manufacturing you have, and let's not make a mistake, manufacturing is the highest component of industry as well. So we do have a fair amount of manufacturing. But if that manufacturing is all in consumables, and most of it is in light or very early stage processing of minerals and the likes of it, then the likelihood that you are generating the kind of implements that ought to go into agriculture, that ought to go into service, is very low. The likelihood that you are doing the kind of R&D that enables services to become more productive is very low. So you've had services growing, but the degree of productivity within services is very low. I'll give you a very practical example. In the US, for instance, every unit output of manufacturing encompasses about 25% of services content. So essentially, every time you produce one article of manufacture, you are about 25% of the value goes into services that you buy. If you look at Ghana, where the mining sector, for instance, has about 98.5% of asset formation within industry. So essentially, most of our capital formation within industry is in the mining sector. Most of the services they buy are not local and domestic, and they are not sufficiently likely to lead to high productivity. So you do have some industrialization. It's just not linked well with the rest of the economy, particularly with agriculture and with services. And that has also led to insufficient innovation.
Bright, this is amazing. Yeah. You used Prof and Doc used half of their time, and you've used the rest of it. So you will pay the rest back. But I think this is fantastic because you've been as a broad angle to this, because Prof started with the economic factors, colonialism, maladjustments, labor productivity. Doc added to it, and you've broadened it to speak about fundamental misdiagnosis of the problem, and then essentially absence of rigorous policy debate, and then of course the elite vacating their responsibility, and of course the inevitable consequence being every policy can work. And then you give two good case studies of manufacturing. I hope you can elaborate as we continue, and also when you come to the solution. So I just want to get everybody's first comment, which is why I'm coming in. So Dr. Theo Acheampong, thank you so much. Let's hear you on the problem. I think we said a lot on the problem, but I still feel there are angles to the problem that you can bring. So what do you believe the challenge is?
Thank you once again, and pleasure to be here. I think I can. Okay, great. I was hearing myself. I think a lot has been said already by a number of our speakers. I mean, for me, really, I also look at it from two frames of thought. The first one is to look at the external sort of factors, and some of them have been mentioned: colonialism, etc., and commodity price changes, and things like capital flows and related matters. But then there's also the internal, which is what Bright was also trying to point us to in relation to the governance related issues. And I think for me, I have come to the realization that fundamentally what we have as a country and as a people is a governance problem, because all of the economic challenges that we're going through is fundamentally as a result of the governance challenges or the policy choices that have been made over the years. We're not on video, but I've got a book here with me, and the title of the book is The Gold Coast Handbook. This book was written in 1937, and it gives a lot of statistics about the Gold Coast at the time and the issues therein. And there's a particular place in the book where, in the aftermath of the Great Depression in the late 1920s, early 30s, we saw cocoa prices plummeting. And cocoa farmers in Ghana, or then Gold Coast, some of them moved all the way from the Ekuapem area to come to Accra to protest about the low prices that they have been getting, and basically the fact that we have not been adding a lot of value to that. You can play this 1932, 1933 story and fast forward 80, 90 years, and we're still at the level or at the stage where the economy is predominantly dependent on these three commodities, like Prof mentioned. At the time, it was just cocoa. Now we've got oil and other things. But the problem is how to use those inputs in terms of taking your raw materials and taking the labor and taking the capital and creating value internally in a way that allows your economy to be strong and to be competitive. And that's where I think we have missed the boat, because a lot of the factors that are at play, particularly the domestic factors, the 4-year election cycles that we're used to, and some of the quote and unquote these structural adjustment neoliberal policies that we're pursuing have not given us enough space and room to do the deep thinking and the deep policy choices that are required to be made. So I'm speaking pretty much similar to the points that Bright has been making. Because if you look, and this is my final point, if you look at the way we've been running policies in this country over the last 20 or so years, it's often at the whim and the caprice of either the president or some minister or some election promise. There is not a deep conversation or a deep analysis in terms of what that policy entails and what, for example, the trade-offs would have to be in relation to those policies. So what then happens is that we are always counting inputs. So we're always counting the number of roads that I have built. We're always counting, oh, I've done 10 hospitals, or I have suddenly promised 111 hospitals under Agenda 101. But we're not counting or spending enough time to think about, so what does this actually do in terms of productivity? Whether the movement of goods and people, or whether you're getting health outcomes improve across the board. Because if you start the conversation at that deep level of thinking about outcomes rather than inputs, then it forces one necessarily to look at the interconnections between policies and the trade-offs that you've got to make and what you need to do to sustain your economy going forward. So I think fundamentally, the economic problems that we have faced over the years is just an effect or a manifestation of a bigger issue. And the bigger issue really comes down to the governance and the internal domestic factors. As for the external shocks and the external factors, they would always be there. The IMF, World Bank, and the likes that we blame, there are other countries that also have gone through similar programs and things, but they have found a way to work around that. So why is it that suddenly we are only the ones that every time that there is a shock, we tend to be affected the most? And I think really it comes down fundamentally to the governance related issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Atiu Acheampong. For those of you who just came in, I think more than half of our speakers have spoken now for the first presentation. The last speaker I see whose mic is on is Josephine, although I think she's disappeared now. I don't know, Josephine, if you are there. Let's hear your take. I can't see Professor Ebo Texan, neither can I see Japoma, but Dr. Josephine Bakun Amponsa, I think I saw you, but you disappeared. Are you there? I think she isn't. All right. I will wait for her by asking a question. So Theo, you sort of nicely distinguish between external and internal factors. And you grouped Bright's presentation under the internal. And then you said that external will always be there. But Bright makes a point about rigorous debate around policies. I think it was 2 days ago I had a discussion around 30 years of the Constitution or something. And Yawon Sako, who's a high executive at Unilever at some point, somebody whose views are quite strong when it comes to at least the consumer space, he took on the neoliberal orthodoxy. All right. He spoke a lot about it, and he felt that is the set of policy prescriptions that he considers neoliberal, which we have pursued since 1990, have not helped us. I wanted a volunteer, either you or Dr. Kujo, to give me, like, when they say neoliberal economic policies or the neoliberal orthodoxy, and they are, what are they? Can you give me like the top 5 characteristics so that we all know we are talking about the same thing.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yeah, let me just take a quick stab at it. I'm sure the others can come in. The first thing really is that, okay, you should open up your market. What does that mean? Privatization, sell your state-owned enterprises, liberalize your exchange rate regime. So instead of, for example, pegging it to the dollar or other baskets of currency, let it be a free float, get all sorts of incentives for foreign direct investment and let these investors come in. And the idea is that there's going to be a trickle down of those interventions or policies to the populace. That at the core is what the whole neoliberalism is really about. There are other things related to that. The evidence on that is actually quite clear for many of the countries in the developing world. And there's lots of work done about this empirically, but also by the IMF and others, that neoliberalism has largely failed in trying to lift a lot of people out of poverty. And in fact, it even deepened poverty. It's led to deindustrialization and a whole lot of other set of factors. So yes, that's quite an issue that we've got to address. But at the same time, you also see other smaller countries that also implemented some flavors, right, of these policies, whilst also trying to safeguard their local industries, and they've been able to leverage or use that to their advantage. But by and large, the consensus in the literature and from the IMF and the World Bank, the Bretton Woods, is that this has not largely worked in trying to fix the fundamental issues of trickling down to support poverty alleviation and enhancing the well-being of the people, because it's only focused often on big numbers or outcomes, so economic growth, but the quality of the growth, where that growth is coming from, what are the trade-offs, the jobs and all of that often is missing in the debate.
Wonderful. Dr. Cudjoe, is there anything else you can add about the neoliberal orthodoxy? I heard Dr. Yaw Graham at Legon a few months ago talk about, for example, the emphasis on cash crops as against food crops. And he says that was also part of the neoliberal orthodoxy. And then he also made a few other points. Theo has given us about 4. Can you sort of add a bit more so that the listeners know what we mean when we say neoliberal economic policies? And whilst you do that, what is the alternative? Is there an alternative to neoliberal? People talk about the heterodox economics. Does heterodox economics have a set of policy principles, or is just anti-neoliberal, so that those non-economists on the call can know what exactly we are talking about when we start discussing these economic terms? Dr. Cudjoe.
Yes, thank you very much, Bernard. I think Dr. Champon has said quite a lot, but picking on a few things he said, as well as some of what Bright said, in order to summarize and then expand. I think on the question of neoliberal economics, what we have to bear in mind is that, well, as Ha-Joon Chang put it, there's one economics, but many recipes, which broadly means that depending on how you think about how an economy works, you then believe certain things are more important than others. So prior to the advent of what we now call neoliberal economics, there was what used to be the statist version of economic thinking, where the state or the developmental state idea was pretty much dominant. But the experiences of a few countries, particularly in the developing world, and also inflation that peaked somewhere in the 70s and latter part 80s in Europe and America, meant a revision in the way economics was being broadly taught and also practiced. And towards the end of the 90s, there were these sets of policies that seemed to have been agreed upon, largely by Western policymakers, concerning the direction in which an economy should be managed. So in addition to some of what Theo had said, there are a few things that also border on us, particularly the shall we call the spread of democracy, because somewhere in the latter part of the 80s and early 90s, there was all these stories about how democracy was good for growth and the like, and the opening up of an economy. So tying in with what Dr. Yao Graham alluded to, which is the essence of playing on your comparative advantage, which simply means that instead of trying to, as it were, create industries where you haven't got the advantage, because broadly speaking, you may not have the skills or the resources, you probably need to focus on developing those aspects of your economy. And for countries like us, these aspects will be mainly the agricultural or natural resource-based sectors. And then focusing largely on these areas for the exports, which would give us the revenues over time. Hopefully, that might help in the development process. But alongside all of this is this, the cutting down or the dismantling of the state in some form within that economic space. So if you put in these, in addition to some of what Theo has said, what you basically are verging on in terms of neoliberal economics is the power of the market, and how the belief in the market, in allocating resources, in ensuring efficiency, in giving us the so-called best outcomes becomes the norm. But yes, there's been experiences in Asia, particularly if you take the South Korean experience and some of the other East Asian experiences, which point, and of course lately the Chinese experience, which point to some form of, well, I won't call it an anti-neoliberal, but slightly diluted, depending on the strengths and histories of the economies, more or less. So if you take the case of China, the state has played a very strong role in all the process, even though it also fronts private enterprise. But there's always a state hand somewhere. Now, what this basically points to, if you think of a solution, is whether the state is an efficient organizer, an efficient manager, or an efficient implementer, either of policies or programs which will enable the market to work very well. So I wouldn't necessarily say there's a heterodox version or a neoliberal. I mean, these are debates which are either academic or policy-wise carried out. But in terms of practice, what we would usually be confronted by or with are issues of objectivity in terms of outcomes that can be measured, and whether these can be translated into an improvement in the standards of living of the people, as well as increasing the value of output created over time in an economy. So the balance is really about where the state and the market are able to cooperate effectively to achieve these broad objectives. I don't know if you want to ask a question on that.
Wonderful. This is great. Thank you. So we have a quorum. 6 out of the 8 panelists are on. The person talking was supposed to be a panelist, but because the moderator could not connect, he reassigned himself to be a moderator. So I'll save you of my own views on this. Enough views have been expressed. We are still waiting for Professor Ebo Texan and Professor Ajepoma Machechidaku. But I think broadly, the speakers are ad idem on the problem. And I'll just summarize quickly before we come to solutions. Theo does a very beautiful job of breaking it into internal and external. Now, the internal factors, using Bright Simmons, a fundamental diagnosis of the problem because of absence of rigorous policy debate. Few competing schools of economic thought exist. That's his first point. Vacation of responsibility by the elite in holding the political leaders to check. And then we spread our policies thin. No high-stake debate between policy choices and trade-offs. Everything is possible in Ghana economic policy implementation, for which reason we are struggling. And he gives a case study of industrialization and how we've misconceived what it means. Professor Abena Oduro gave us a very strong list. He historically points to colonialism and some of the challenges it poses, some maladjustments it created, She also talks about vulnerability, gold, cocoa, oil being your three main exports, low labor productivity, a very open economy, which is not that big, not enough jobs created. Dr. Kujo elaborates on that by talking about a Greek as well, where we haven't focused on what matters. And he says our economic history is not 56 or 60, 70 years, because the first economic plan was in 51. So he says it's a 70-year threshold. And then he also talks about low technology, industrialization, and weak capacity in that field. And so those are the points that have been made. We've also discussed the neoliberal economic policy orthodoxy, because I kept hearing the issue of policy debates. I wanted a clear view from the panel on the alternative to neoliberal economics. I have heard of things like MMT, and MMT is saying, for example, again, if I'm wrong, the academics can correct me, that look, yes, we are a small economy, but the problem we have as a country is that because we are not monetarily sovereign, we will never develop. And the monetary sovereignty has three factors. They basically talk about trade imbalances occasioned by a food deficit and energy deficit, and then weak industrial capacity. That leads to a lot of challenges with forex. And then you have imported inflation and its concomitant effects. They believe that there's a solution, and they feel like inflation targeting is not the only solution. There's a lot to be said about MMT. I would have loved if there was an economist on the panel to give me a more clear alternative to neoliberalism, all right, whether it's MMT or other types of economics. I'll be happy to hear this, because we've said neoliberalism is the problem, but we haven't said what the solution is. So that's my way of framing the next part of the discussion. I'm coming back to Professor Odro. What, in your view, is the way to go in addressing these economic challenges historically? And if you have an answer to the question about the alternative to neoliberalism as well, I'll be happy to hear you. So, Professor Odro, you have the floor again. Oh, I think we lost her. I think we lost Professor Odro. Bright, let me bring you back, and then we'll see how it goes. So, Bright, you didn't really use the word neoliberalism, but that seems to be a term I've brought into the discussion. What is there an alternative? Is neoliberalism the problem, by the way? Is there an alternative to it? And what's the way forward?
Thanks, Bernard. So neoliberal orthodoxy and its various manifestations have become the latest bogeyman of development economics in our part of the world, because I don't know if you recall, but a few decades before, we had neocolonialism, and most of our problems were attributable to neocolonialism. I have a lot of respect for the debate that has been going on in development economics in respect of this matter, and I think Theo is entirely right in his summation of the literature and the way that we've seen the likes of Ha-Joon Chang use very clear empirical evidence to suggest that most of the growth that we saw in the places in the world where we've seen the most dramatic growth miracles, like in in East Asia, most of those places did not really pursue what might be regarded as neoliberal. I have a few concerns. One is whether in our particular economic history in Ghana, this debate is even relevant. And I will summarize. One, we have an experience of all types of economic philosophy-driven policymaking. So we spent from 1960, before we did the 7-year plan, and then consolidated by the 7-year plan, all the way to something around 83, before seeing a dramatic change in actual economic policy. Many people are not aware, but the chief architect of the 7-year plan were primarily those on the center right in Ghana politics, Omar Abo, G.H. Mensah, etc. They were the ones behind the 7-year plan in the 62 era. And so we've always had a fair amount of harmony when it comes to the basic strategy for development in this country. It's not been very radical at the philosophical level. So if you think of Omabo and J.H. Mensah being the architects of Nkrumah's main plan, and J.H. Mensah being, senior minister under Kufuor when he came back to power, or when the UP tradition came back to power, it gives you a sense of that continuity, which we often forget. The second point is that we have tried heterodox policies, So we've done our Hajunjan and Hajunchan. We have spent time significantly interfering in economic management in this country at political level. There was a time when control prices were such that if you breach control pricing, you go to jail. If I tell you that, when the military government was overthrown, when the military government handed power back to the civilians authorities in 1979, the succeeding government more or less pursued the same revolutionary policies as well as the same socialist policies that the revolutionaries had come to complain about. Because remember that throughout the Champon era, we were talking about commanding heights of the economy. Most people forget that. It was really very much heterodox economics. The government must drive growth. The government must lead us out of our doldrums, etc. And then the revolutionaries said that was not working. They did not, of course, attribute that to philosophy. They attributed it to execution. And they overthrew a Champon. And they threw a Kufu. But more or less, it was the same government. And then when they left power, they tightened price controls. When they left power, people were still being taken to court for breaching price control rules. And I have a lot of court cases in which people were jailed for pricing fishing nets and certain products beyond control prices. We did all that until more or less the country came to the verge of collapse in 1983. And then we decided we're going to adjust certain things and do structural adjustment. The truth is, if you look at our tariff levels, and here I'm talking about the infant economy, infant industries and protectionism argument and the rest of it. If you look at our tariff level throughout that period, they were of course extremely high because not only did we have quota systems and the chit system preventing what you can import and not import, but we also had these strategies of trying to protect infant industries and to prevent goods from coming in. And those tariffs never really went down. So today, they've actually continued to go up. Ghana has some of the highest tariffs in the world. Try bringing in equipment into Ghana and go to the ports and look at the duties that they will post. We have tariffs that are 4 times higher than Malaysia in automotive. We have tariffs that are far higher than South Korea in industrial equipment, even in things we don't produce. So when it comes to saying that we've liberalized our economy completely, I don't think the evidence bears us out. But more importantly, I don't think that we've had a commitment to neoliberalism completely anyway. I think what we've had is what I've tried to explain, which is that it's an anything goes economic policy logic. So they do whatever they want, they mix things up, and it's not even clear. You can't decipher the direction from. So right now, for instance, we have an infant industry protection logic in automotive. That is not the same approach that Japan and South Korea and others that have succeeded in automotive took. But it's similar in some respects. And in some ways, it's driven by protectionism. The other thing that I'm also not too sure that I completely agree with, though I have a lot of respect for the arguments that have been made, and I think they are a good summary of the understanding in the literature as it currently exists, is the role of colonialism in our problems. I think I'll be completely remiss and I'll be completely arrogant if I was to suggest that this is not important, given that the literature as we have it, much better minds than mine, have said that colonialism has had a problem. But we need to look at it in our specific case and see the extent of the contribution. When you look at the colonialism situation in Ghana, colonialism was a very short period of time. We were a colony in more or less from 1900, some will say 1890 thereabout. But most, because after the defeat of Asante, the British were not completely dominant until 1900. And then in 58 years, they were out. Most people assume that colonialism took more than that, but actually it didn't. We had a very short phase of colonialism, 60 years of colonialism. The highest capital formation in our history was between 1891 and 1911. We saw capital formation increase from 239 units, and I won't bother with the actual units, to 3,420, nearly 15 times. In the last 20 years, gross capital formation in this country has only grown by 3 times. So if you think of a 20-year period during colonialism where gross capital formation grows by 15 times, versus 20 times. You can't completely assume that entire colonial saw no economic growth.
All right.
On the issue of solutions, I think quite clearly. Yes, okay. Let me just.
I wanted to take you on a bit because
Okay.
I'm a bit baffled because you, in your initial submission, you said that there were few competing schools of thought, right? And that we don't have rigorous enough debate, right? And then there's a suggestion that the general policy framework we've worked with since the early 90s, so that would be like 33 years, have been largely neoliberal. And I think we all agree to that. And yet you don't see, I say you're not sure if the debate is useful, the debate of whether neoliberal versus non-neoliberal.
No, not that the debate is useful. I'm asking whether it's relevant to ask the question given the heterogeneity of our experience. Essentially, is it really true that our history is one of neoliberalism for the most part, and we now must ask ourselves whether there's a heterodox alternative? I'm questioning that.
No. The
By suggestion.
Right, that's not the question. The question is, for 30 years, we agree pursuing neoliberal economics, right? So I know that from 1951, we've had different kinds of economic policies, state-led stuff and all of that. But the debate must be looked at from where we are now. And in the past 30 years, if we've been pursuing the liberal economic policies, is there rigorous debate about alternatives? So we can't then stretch back to the that's point number one. And point number two, yes, J.H. Mensah wrote the foreword to the development plan, but J.H. Mensah also fell out with Nkrumah. And the 29-year-old J.H. Mensah who wrote that foreword may not necessarily be the same guy with the same ideas who became Kufuor's senior minister. So bringing J.H. in, I get the point you're trying to make, but I don't think it's very fair because the kinds of ideas that Kufuor then pursued under, or J.H. pursued under Kufuor as senior minister, even the leverage he had may not have been the same in the 7-year economic plan in a different time. But I understand what you're trying to say that.
Okay, so let me try and tie that up quickly.
But
you will have to mute your speaker for the speakers to hear us.
From the past 30 years. Yes, let me hear you.
You will have to mute your speakers because otherwise there's an echo. Okay, so what I was saying is that for the debate to be sharp, we can assume that for the most part, we've had a neoliberal strategy. And the question is, we haven't tested heterodox strategies. And therefore, maybe that is the challenge. And I'm saying that I'm not sure that is as clean a diagnosis as that. Because historically, we've had a fair amount of consensus on general philosophy, which is the whole idea of this Gettysburg economy, and we must move it from the Gettysburg economy, etc. That you hear many people say. When you look at the different development plans and the way it's gone, it is true that at a certain period of our history, we're much more statist, and that increasingly we are less statist. My argument, though, is that when you look at what we call less statist today, and since the 90s, and you look at the actual numbers, most of the arguments fall apart. And I'm giving you specific examples. I'm saying that think of this argument that we are too open on the economy. Then look at the actual policy history from 1990. Look at tariff levels. Compare our tariff levels with Thailand. Compare our tariff levels with Malaysia. Take, for instance, automotive. Look at our tariffs for automotive between Ghana and Thailand. Look at how much Thailand is doing in automotive production. Now I think the largest producer in that part of the world. And then compare our tariff history. So whatever the policy instruments were, if we pick up heterodox instruments and say we use high tariffs for infant industry protection, we have not been able to execute it properly. So listen to the argument very carefully. Then take, for instance, capital controls. And look at when, since 1990, we liberalized the capital account, the financial account, etc., etc. Look at all the other mechanisms for control of capital flows that we've had to implement, even when we've tried to do liberalization, and compare it to Southeast Asia. Most people forget that the 1997 crisis in Asia was primarily due to they having a much more liberalized financial ecosystem than we did by then. And then even after they imposed capital control because of the lessons of that episode, when you look at actual practice, in terms of if you had $1 million to move it out of Ghana, versus if you have $1 million and you want to move it out of Malaysia, we are not necessarily more neoliberal in that sense. So it's easy that, because of maybe the texts that we use and the language we use, the rhetoric, it appears as if we are very neoliberal. I'm saying when you look at the actual policies, it's not that clear to me that we've been this gung-ho about neoliberalism and therefore we haven't tested heterodox policy. Rather, and here is where I'm summing up, rather, we have not executed whatever policy we want to execute well, whether it's heterodox or neoliberal. When you look at the actual practice, it has been very knee-jerky. It's not been driven by very clear articulation of the strategy. There hasn't been led by debate and then final conclusion on the path. And the best example is automotive. We've said we now want to do automotive policy. Take the actual automotive policies and look at them and see whether the actual strategies for technology transfer are sound. You find out that the supply chain strategy in terms of how you get inputs and components is not very sound.
Yeah, right. Thank you. The line became a bit sketchy. I will bring Professor Abena Oduro in. I asked the question earlier about solutions. And so, Prof, if you can hear me, what do you think we need to do to essentially transform our economy in a sustainable way? Prof. Abena Oduro, if you can hear me, you have the floor. All right. I don't think I have Prof. Even though I see Prof on, I don't think she can hear me.
Hello?
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Prof, go ahead.
What can we do to change things? Well, I think a lot has been said in terms of policy effectiveness. But then also, if there's something that we've observed in our economy today and linking it to policy effectiveness and choice of policies, the growing inequalities that exist, inequality in terms of income, inequality in terms of gender inequality, spatial inequality in terms of region. So I think also as we are deliberating on policy options and policy effectiveness, we need to be quite conscious about issues of distribution. And in this, I'm sorry, for about 10, 15 minutes, we've been out, even though you probably saw our microphone on, we couldn't hear what was going on. But I did catch a bit of the discussion on the neoliberal versus the heterodoxy. And you could say to some extent, in terms of the neoliberal perspective, they don't put enough emphasis on issues of inequality because, as Theo had said, there is this trickle down. There is this trickle down effect. So I would say that as we are deliberating and designing policy, we need to be much more conscious of the distributional effects of our policy, because we can't afford to leave a particular group of people out as we are trying to make progress and improving upon our well-being. So that's what I would throw into the mix of what previous speakers may have said.
Wonderful. Charlene, is it possible to know who wants to comment or ask a question in terms of listeners? Because I see a lot of people. I see Joe Jackson on the call. I see quite a number of people, Nia and co. So if I can be helped to know who wants to make a comment. I see quite a number of questions I would like to read as well. I wanted to ask you a question before that, though, Theo. One of the problems I have is that, look, we import $2 billion worth of food and $1 billion worth of fossil fuels, right? Uh-huh. And I feel like in the energy crisis of the 2013-2014, we rather tended towards more fossil fuel type of power generation, which predisposes us to a lot of dependence on forex, which we don't have, and then the food issue as well. How easy is it to diversify our energy sources away from fossil fuels in a bid to reduce our vulnerability to the dollar as part of the solution? and also dependence on food imports. If you can comment a bit on that before I open the floor.
So as for the food one, I think it's interesting because in a sense it's like talking about Operation Feed Yourself and other related schemes. But it's about thinking about the big picture is important, but how to get there is actually for me equally important. So if you want to do an agriculture revolution like has been espoused here in other places, the inputs are extremely important. It's not just doing or talking about, for example, planting for food and jobs and the rhetoric, but I'm sitting and I'm asking myself, if you take the rope and dope stuff, right, the mechanized equipment that you need, your tractors that you need, the hoes and cutlasses that are mechanized that you need. Those sort of things you've got to be able to actually produce them internally and be able to then use that to support your industrial development. So the point is connecting or not looking at it as an agric problem, but looking at it as an agric plus industry problem that you need to solve. So if you take your Christo Asafo, for example, right, the expectation then would be that you're providing some support to them at the state level. And this could be tax breaks. This could be other, a combination of industrial policies that you're providing to get them to produce a lot more hoes, a lot more mechanized equipment, a lot more small scale tractors that can get to the farmers at the same time, using, for example, like your natural gas to produce fertilizer and things like that. And it comes back really to some of the conversations we're talking about here. The thing for me is we've got to be pragmatic. And that's one of the lessons that we can learn from the East Asian miracle. We shouldn't be boxed too much into this, state-led economic orthodoxy or even modern monetary policy heterodoxy. We've got to look at our circumstances and what actually will work for us. And I think it's a combination of both markets and also a strong role of the state in directing or shaping those sort of outcomes. And it's extremely important because if you look at how East Asia and the likes have done it, it's one of the lessons that we've got to learn from there. And it applies whether you're dealing with agriculture or you're dealing with the whole energy transition question. We now have in Ghana, they've got an energy transition framework. And one of the things is that by 2050, we should be doing nuclear energy and at the same time reducing our consumption of gas for thermal power. The question then is, we've got to work our way backwards and start putting in place the investments that are required to do that. But it's not necessarily going to get foreign direct investment and throwing all these freebies to the people. Our enterprises and locals equally need to be a part of that game, because that's really the only way you're able to create that value and ensure that the value goes down and is able to create the jobs and ultimately allow you to be much more, economically able to withstand some of these external shocks.
Thank you, Theo. Lots of comments have come in the chat. I'm going to read a few, and then I'm not sure if somebody wants to comment whether they would have to request to be made a speaker. But here are a few of the comments. So Nanekri Anyido, who says it's not the length of colonialism, it's the fact that the fundamental structure of our national economy was set up in the colonial period. So not a long period, but enduring impact. She goes on to say the pervasiveness of a neoliberal ideology is not only seen in our policy making, but also in the global economic context in which we have to operate. Thank you, Nanikia, for that one. Mike Aman Penny says, I think Bright made the core point. The issue is data and evidence tracking inputs and outcomes, because there is no one-size-fits-all set of policies to get ourselves out of this issue. What policy history in Ghana has shown is that inputs and outputs are non-linear. And then he goes on to say the issue of governance is even problematic because the neoliberal Washington consensus idea did not work. That has raised the issue of good governance versus good enough governance due to complexity, the best practice versus the best fit. Selassie is asking whether there has ever been an economic theory postulated for and by Africans, because all he hears is implementation of someone's economic policy, which clearly has never and will never work for us. A few more comments. The same person says Bright is making a caricature of heterodox economics because China used a type of heterodox economics which is very much market oriented. There are types of heterodox economics, and Marxist movement of heterodox has been rife in Ghana, and that is what he is talking about, you say. Dr. Kujo, are you still in the call, or you have gone home? Dr. Kujo, are you there?
Hello.
Hello. What are your top 2 or 3 solutions for creating a roadmap to Ghana's economic transformation?
Well, thank you very much, Bernard. Actually, if you think of top 2, I'm not quite sure whether there can be a top 2, because every solution, if we can call it a solution, is important. So what I would say is the first, given we're thinking about an economy, is in relation to the management of the economy. And that broadly centers on the effectiveness and efficiency of governance and the government bureaucracy. And in that regard, particularly because we are only focusing on the economy more specifically, we should be thinking in terms of a very disciplined and efficient technocratic bureaucratic setup that is able to achieve set objectives and also able to review whatever programs are in place to ensure that, well, mistakes are corrected as implementation is ongoing. And then linked to that is in relation to how the other actors of the economy, particularly businesses, are able to either get access to finance, which sometimes has been said to be a very big issue, but more broadly translate this into more productive outcomes, especially in terms of generating necessary employment and also achieving meaningful wages for workers. Because in all of what we think about as solutions, surely there'll be so many programs and plans and the like. But these 2, in my opinion, represent what we can call the core, around which we can then be thinking of all the related or allied sorts of solutions that can be put in place, whether we think of those solutions as specific plans or projects which need to be implemented with designated or clear-cut objectives that need to, that lead to some form of measurable improvement in the overall, economic performance and the well-being of the people, because that's extremely important, the well-being of the people, because normally we would tend to think of the economy broadly in terms of how the GDP is faring, but it needs to translate to a much broader spread, because within that, we can then be thinking of the next levels of energies that can be created for further growth and development moving forward.
Wonderful. People are asking what my own views are. At the beginning, I made a few points, but I would pick 2 key things I think we should focus on. The fact that Operation Feed Yourself was interrupted by a coup does not mean it's a bad idea. I think if you spend $2 billion importing food and your palate is based on things produced in places like Ukraine and the US, you really cannot be economically free. So I think there must be a commitment to producing what we eat. I'm not saying we shouldn't produce cocoa or coffee, but I think that we must spend a lot more time being food sovereign. And that would also mean that we must listen to people like CSIR more. In Francophone Africa, they try and mix their flour, for example, with other local materials. We are very dependent on imported food, and we have to boost production of local food. So for me, I think that's, whether you are neoliberal or heterodox, it's just a common sense thing to do. You can't spend $2 billion importing rice, chicken, tomatoes, and all the things that you eat and expect that you will not have currency problems. Number two, Bright, I hear you on the mischaracterization of the manufacturing, where you eloquently point out that it's not about percentage of manufacturing in GDP or percentage of manufacturing responsible for labor. I think the fundamental problem is that we don't make enough things that we use, and we don't repair enough things as a country. So what I think we need to focus on as a country is technical and vocational education, to the point of being able to, if not even making things, repairing things. For example, like we buy cars, and then we use the cars, and then when the cars have faults, fitters just basically use iteration to try and solve the problem. Or we don't even have people who can do proper plumbing when you import very expensive plumbing materials, or even in the oil industry, welding. So I think that there must be a serious commitment to TVET, where people know how to make things and repair things. That is also a way of dealing with unemployment, because grammar type education, we discussed this on air today, is good, but if you have a population bulge like we have, you need more people with skills that they can do their own businesses, plumbers, mechanics, people who can repair broken down engines and things like this. I feel like those are two additional solutions. And then the whole Galamsey issue and its effect on food production, the environment, and its negative effect on our politics, which is going to worsen our electoral outcomes, because we are going to vote for criminals to get into office because they've been funded by Galamsey and the rest of it. I really think there must be a big conversation around that. Financing our politics, the political economy is as important. So the point about implementation is because of the political economy. So it's not because they don't know that going to the international market to borrow after a roadshow of a certain amount of money is not good, but it either benefits them personally, or there isn't enough rigorous debate, as Bright said, or frankly, they don't have enough time. So you keep doing the wrong things and you keep getting those outcomes. So those are my views. So go back to feeding yourself, add value, make things and repair things. TVET is not for dropouts. Let's build a country of mechanics. Professor Jepoma Jaketako, we are happy to have you on the call. We've said a lot about the problem, and we are trying to come up with solutions. So thank you for joining. If you can hear me, I don't even know how I'm going to if somebody asks you what are the top 3 most important things we need to do to reverse 70 years of economic dystopia, what would you say, Prof?
Okay, good evening. And I'm very sorry, I was having challenges with getting on. Please, can you hear me?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Okay, great. So I think I'm not sure whether some of the things that I wanted to speak about have already been spoken about, but I think that one of the biggest thing that I would like to share would have to do with us having a long-term development plan that actually guides our development trajectory in this country, because we don't seem to be moving along any plan. Our plans, or the things that we tend to do, are guided by And those are usually populist things that are being done. And so we tend to see that things that are done by a particular government would be abandoned, and then by another government that succeeds the particular government. And so we don't have a structure that we are following. And that leads to waste of resources. And I think that it can be one of the reasons that is contributing to our high debt levels that we are seeing in the economy. So having a long-term development plan, I think, is something that we need to start thinking about as a country. We do have NDPC, but I think that NDPC is under-resourced. We need to get NDPC very well resourced to be able to guide us in all of these. Another thing that I think we have to be doing has to do with us taking charge of high productive sectors that have similar characteristics as manufacturing sectors, but appeal to the kind of skill spectrum that we have in our economy. So we have low to moderate skilled workers in our economy. You want a sector like agro-processing to be leading. You want tourism to be leading. The reason why I'm actually speaking about agro-processing here is because most of our SMEs are found along the value chain of agro-processing. And so to be able to build the private sector, you need our SMEs to do that so that they can champion growth in the economy. Again, promoting something like tourism becomes easy because we already have an advantage with all the resources that we need to be able to promote tourism, and that can help us in our growth agenda. Again, I'm thinking we need to have fiscal discipline. We have had issues. The reason why we keep going to IMF, this is about the 17th time we've been there, is because we don't have that kind of discipline that we need. Not that we don't know what to do, but I think if I'm supposed to put it this way, it's got to do with having the political will to do the sort of things that we have to do as a country. We don't need IMF to come in every now and then to whip us in line. We know what we have to do. We should have that kind of political will to invest in the sectors and in the things that would be okay for us to be investing in, and also to champion ways that we can use to mobilize our revenue. Bernard, I think this is what I would want to share for now.
Wonderful, thank you. Your point about a long-term development plan didn't really come up in the discussion, and I am happy you brought it up as well. Of course, fiscal discipline as well, and the other points you make. So thank you, Professor. Our newly minted Professor Ejipo Majek. I'm still trying to figure out how to allow the comments, because I feel because we started 30 minutes late, we have a good 30 minutes. And so, Charlene and co, if somebody wants to talk, I don't know whether they in Zoom they show their hand. How do we get people to voice out what they want to say? Okay, so good. If you want to speak, request to speak, right? So if you want to make a comment, request to speak, and then the team would convert you from a listener into a speaker. So we'll give ourselves 5 minutes to do this whilst I read more comments. Or if you don't want to speak, you can put your comment in the chat. But if you want to speak, either by way of question or comment, please just request, and then the administrative team would respond by changing your status. But make sure within your permissions in your app, you have activated the speaker. Otherwise, when we give you that, we send you that request, or you make the request, you're not going to be able to speak if your Twitter settings do not activate your mic. I hope I'm making sense. So I will read some more comments, and then I will take questions or comments from you. Molinari says economic transformation is great, but before that you need cultural transformation because of things like mediocrity, short-sightedness, self-centeredness, entitlement, victimhood mentality. Molinari, thank you. We spent a lot of time on the hardware of economic development, and I think your point brings us into the software very strongly. Sek Sudo says the fundamental problem as a nation is we are vision blind. We don't have committed long-term national development agenda. We have given politicians too much power for making effective short-term policy framework without any analysis. It's time for a national research. Sherlock Pierre says, how does the politicization of everything, especially the private sector, factor into this conversation? Ideally, at a stage of development, the private sector should be devoid of such levels of politics to the point where profit levels are directly affected by political involvement. Thank you, Sherlock, for your comment. My company says Ghana does have a long-term development plan. The issue is implementation and government's adherence. Professor Mutexin is supposed to be part of the panel, and we didn't know where he was, but he's appeared. So, Ebo, Prof, are you there? If you are, kindly take the floor. All right, Ebo, I don't seem to see you. Okay, Musa, you've been made a speaker, so I guess you want to make a comment. Global. Okay, sorry, Ebo, you are there. Okay, Musa, hold on. Ebo, go ahead.
Oh, I've been here for some time. I was here when it started. I tried to make it. I've been here, so I don't know what you want to speak about.
No, what should we do to transform Ghana's economy? That's what I'm asking.
I think that point has been delivered by most other speakers, but I want to add that we have to realize that we cannot keep on doing the same things we've done in the past and get a different solution to our development challenges. We got to, like some of the speakers have already alluded to, we've got to try as much as possible to make our public sector very efficient. It's very important because you see, the key to private sector development and the private sector leading growth is to be supported by a very efficient, benevolent public sector. And when I talk about the efficient public sector, I'm talking about the whole government machinery, especially with respect to our fiscal policy. We got to prioritize the needs that we have, given that our ability to raise revenue is limited. And when I say it is limited, we can only collect so much. We can't collect more than we can collect in a sector that, in a country where majority of those employed are in the informal sector, where wages are very low. So even if we have infrastructure to tax everybody in the informal sector, that is not going to bring any much more revenue. If we keep on spending like this, we are going to keep on running those huge fiscal deficits. It's important that we take away fiscal populism out of our body politic. It's important that the social interventions that governments come up with align with our development policy. Yes, the NDPC has a development plan. It has a long-term development plan. The point that is worth noting is that no government is held responsible for not championing development along our national development plans. More often than not, most of these parties that come to power normally use their party manifestos as a guide to national development, and that is very, very unfortunate, because most of the things in a party manifesto are political promises that are made. Some of them are promises that Ghana doesn't need to fulfill because our economy is not structured in that way. I mean, some of them are things that we should be talking about, but of course, given the political environment and when these promises are made, it is geared towards winning an election, but that shouldn't drive national development. And Bernard, if you observe over some time, a couple of years, or especially around the 2020 elections. I think one of the main things the parties were competing about was counting the number of promises they had made and how much those promises they had fulfilled. And that was very, very unfortunate. The question that we should be asking them is, to what extent have you actualized our development plans of moving Ghana even beyond aid? What have we actually done as governments in power in trying to advance the development in the sectors that should lead our growth? At times, it's very important to take our national budget and begin to ask very relevant questions of our governments that are in power. I mean, if you raise revenue, and a lot of the revenue is going to be paying for compensation, interest payments, and statutory payments, and nothing left for capital expenditure, then it is quite unfortunate. We cannot go on like this because, Bernard, there's no point in readjusting our GDP and having things look good when the actual situation on the ground isn't that good. So yes, we need to refocus. We need to change the ways in which we're doing things, because we cannot keep on going on like this. And it's important that a very good concept like this Ghana Compact that we are all part of, or you are trying to champion, is made quite clear to all our parties and get them to sign on a compact that would be used to judge their performance when they are in power. I think when we begin to ask of politicians some of these very laudable initiatives, we will change the way we do things, and our quest to get at least some level of development and get a majority of people out of poverty is something that we can easily achieve if we go on this new path. So these are a few words I have from the beginning.
Thank you. Let me bring in Musa. Musa, you activated your mic.
Yes.
Let's see.
All right. I want to make a comment with regards to the last but one contributor. She mentioned the long-term development plan that we don't have, and I think in the absence of that, there's something that we should have learned, or probably we could have learned some time ago. There is something they call government spending plan that goes up to 10 years. So if you have that long-term plan, I mean, government budget plan for the next 10 years, this would, travel between, 2 or 3 election cycles. Then you force public sector organizations to think beyond election cycles, even with their fiscal planning, so that people don't rush to do short-term things. Because how this works is that when you have what we call government spending plan for 10 years, state agencies or organizations are allowed to move forward or backwards within the same envelope of 10 years, so that you don't try to spend the money that you have, because you will lose it the following year. And that has been the problem we've had in this country for many years. And towards the end of the financial year of the government, whatever is left in the budget, if it is there, we'll go and blow it, even if we don't need it. So I think we need to really have that kind of mindset or system in place to be able to allow companies to think 10 years, spending plan, a budget approved, and then you are allowed to move forward or accelerate or decelerate, depending upon what you want to do. That will cut a lot of the short-term thinking that we've been doing in this country.
Thank you, Musa. I want to ask a question to the floor, because as I listen to the submissions, what is getting clear is that theoretical knowledge about what to do is not the problem. It is the ability to implement that's the challenge. And the ability to implement is a challenge because we, the people speaking, are not the ones implementing. And the guys implementing don't seem to have the same interest or same concern as those of us on this call and many other Ghanaians. So the question is, can we fix our economics without fixing our politics? Or in a different way, how much of this is because of the governance system which has come out of the political system? Theo, I think you said a bit about the governance issues, right? We've seen countries on various extremes, China, Korea, Singapore, US, UK at different stages get some semblance of economic development. But the question for the floor, maybe Bright, you may want to deal with this. How much of this economic problem is because of the politics and the governance system, and therefore you can't unravel the two?
I think you're okay. So I mean, I'm not sure I got the question very clearly. Can you repeat the exact question?
Can we fix our economics without fixing our politics?
Okay, very interesting question. But before I try answering that, I thought I should react to one or two things that came up in the comments, and where I feel that perhaps the people writing were directing them to me, so just out of courtesy. So I'm not caricaturing the division between major philosophies of development and how to approach them. Actually, obviously, there's a pressure of time. But the key thing that I'm trying to put across is that we have to be more sectoral in the way that we are doing the analysis. And that will include the question that you were asking. Because there will be instances where, because of the political sensitivity of the context, you cannot make progress at all until you fix certain political, economy, infrastructural issues. And then there will be other instances where there is a lot of room for pure technocratic execution. Let me give you practical examples. If you take, so two things. One is that, let's use the national development planning issue that have come up. There are two levels of national development planning, actually three levels. One is sectoral and specific. So we have, for instance, the Ghana Infrastructure Plan that we are working on. We have plans that are related to health, education, and things like that. Any department is supposed to do that and then to coordinate. Then you have very domestic, but holistic and cross-cutting development planning, some of which are long-term and some of which are short and medium-term. Then you have the global planning process, which nowadays everything we do must feed into. So you have the SDGs, you have the African Union Agenda 2063, and within that you have basic frameworks that lead to national determined contributions for COP, that's the Conference of Parties process for climate change, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at that architecture, it's clear that there are some aspects of which are very technocratic and not politically contested. Most of the environment and sustainability related ones are like that. So when you think of how we are doing policy planning around forestry within the framework of the Rio Agenda or REDD+, or any of those green growth type of issues, I doubt that there's any MPP and DC issues there. And a lot of the SDG related areas are similar. So think of water, think of sanitation, think of certain aspects of health. Most of it is fairly technocratic and there's been very little contestation. Then you come to areas of industrial policy where credit attribution is very clear. So if I bring a car factory, it's very clear that I brought a car factory. And you can see the way the government puts a lot of emphasis on visible outputs like that. So when there's a lot of emphasis there, it gets politically contested. If I come in and I change SHS from 3 years to 4 years, it's very visible, everybody sees it. If I come in and I make SHS free, it's very visible, everybody sees it. And so it's very politically contested. So that is the nature of the political economy and the way it plays. Where there's political contestation is often because attribution is clear and can play a role in the electoral agenda. And where there is not.
Welcome back, everybody. I think Elon Musk took us off for a few minutes. Please forgive us. We are not too far off from the end. So thank you for your persistence. I will give some summary while we get the other speakers back. If you just joined us, we've been debating the road to Ghana's economic transformation. We've had 7 or so speakers. I was supposed to be a speaker, but I had to step in to moderate because our moderator has been having challenges, Abdul Momin. Speakers have included Bright Simmons, Dr. Emmanuel Kujo, Dr. Theo Champon, Professor Abena Odro, Professor Jepoma Jekedako, and Professor Ebo Texan, as well as Josephine Bakwan Ponsa. We didn't hear Josephine at all because of connection problems, and we belatedly heard from Jepoma and Ebo Texan. Bright was responding to some comments and also addressing the question I asked before we all went off. So I apologize for this. Let me just spend 2 minutes to give context for the discussion, and then I'll take closing remarks from all the speakers. So this conversation is part of the Ghana Compact for Economic Transformation. It's for political and economic transformation. It was launched by the Africa Center for Energy Policy and 7 other policy institutes to address the challenges to development in Ghana. Researchers have surveyed many areas: youth, business, values, and all of those things, economics as well. And we are trying to create a compact that has 6 main components. Now, the ambition of the compact, driven by citizens, focuses on 1, ensuring that the constitution serves Ghana better. So whether that means a new constitution or a revised version, that's a big one. So that's point number 1, constitution. Number 2, a long-term vision and strategy for economic transformation. That's the second leg of the compact, long-term vision and strategy for economic transformation, under which leg we are discussing this topic. Number 3, creating macroeconomic and fiscal stability for sustained growth. Number 4, enabling the private sector to drive economic transformation. Number 5, empowering women as a moral and economic imperative. And number 6, building a secure future for our youth. We've had Twitter spaces on youth, Twitter spaces on values, Twitter spaces on leadership, and even on the constitution, I believe. So that's by way of context. I have about 12 minutes to go. I would bring Bright in to wrap up what he was saying, and then I will give each speaker a couple of minutes to make their concluding remarks. So Bright, thank you for your patience. Can you wrap up the point you were making about technocratic issues that don't have political issues, and then where politics becomes an issue?
Okay, so I was trying to explain for those that were commenting on national development planning how it actually works in Ghana's context and the different levels, sectoral, medium term, short term, etc., how it has to link to global, and how that process has gone on. What we've had a challenge with is the long-term development framework, which has become very contested because the previous government did a 40-year framework within which the medium-term plans and the rest were supposed to be anchored. And the new government decided to ditch that long-term framework and then go back to a new coordination program, which is now run from the presidency, which is a coordination program for the different policies. So that is basically just additional information for those that were asking about a long-term development planning process. It exists. There are parts that are contested, parts that are highly politically sensitive, and parts that are not. The second thing is that, and this links to the economic philosophy issues, there are areas which typically most countries tend to be neoliberal on, and in other areas they are not. So if you look at management of the currency and management of high-level macroeconomic indicators, most of Europe in the post-war period tried to double a little bit. And then by the 90s, after the famous Black Wednesday issue in the UK, where the pound was crashed, most of the European ecosystem have been more or less neoliberal on those kind of high-level macroeconomic issues like inflation targeting and the rest. And then when it comes to industrial policy, Germany doesn't do it the same way as Britain does and the rest. So this is supporting the case that has already been made, that you need to be pragmatic, you need to look at your sector, etc., etc. Coming back to the core of your issue on politics, I think even here, the sectoral dynamics matter. And I was, trying to use the point that you made earlier on about food. And I was wondering whether it was relevant to bring it in, but maybe just because it's interesting, I'll bring it in. Between 1951 and 1961, we obviously prioritized industrialization, but within that, we had agricultural policies. And I was looking at the data recently as to where we performed well and where we didn't perform well. It will surprise you to know that the areas where we didn't perform well in that decade are exactly the areas that we don't perform well today. I'll give you very quick examples and I'll make my bigger point. If you take rice, in 1951, were importing 313 units. By 1961, we're importing 2,514 units. That's a 700% increase in the decade. If you take fruits and vegetables, it was 1,109% or 10x increase in the amount of fruit and vegetables we're importing. And if you take fish, it was a 2.5 growth or 239% increase in that decade. Those are specifically the areas where, notwithstanding policy interventions, we failed. And a lot of it, when you look at it carefully, you find out that that's because they don't respond well to the high-level centralized development planning process where politicians look for the most visible things and try and push it. Take fishing, for instance. In Ghana, fishing, in attempts to be self-sufficient in fish protein, we find out that we run against complicated fisherman and fishing community politics with premix and all of those kind of things. And we forget that. And then we go and look at the end result and we say, why is it that we are now importing a lot of fish and we are running out of fish in our local waters, etc., 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 forgetting that entire chain of politics. So this is just to buttress your point that there are areas where you can't make progress without fixing the politics. If you take fruit and vegetables, horticultural situation, you have a huge problem with transportation and its politics, where the nature of the rules that we create is driven by municipal politics. So depending on how the municipal and district elections and the way that the politics is framed at that local level, road networks are built. Horticulture is extremely sensitive to road network because of high perishability. So you cannot do fruits and vegetables until you do large-scale reform of the way our local government decentralization has now been created. These are the areas where political contestation simply means you need to prioritize. Because if our current politics does not allow us to do certain things, we are just throwing precious bandwidth away trying to reform them. So my argument, and this is very controversial, is forget trying to fix fishing, because you don't in the 4-year time period, you don't have time to fix local government politics. Forget trying to fix fruit and vegetables imports, because in your, so trying to do fruit juices and all of those things, they won't work very well because horticulture requires significant transformation of the spatial demographics of your politics, which you don't have time in your 4-year cycle to achieve. That will mean that we should go to the things where, from a trade-offs point of view, you have serious lopsidedness, even taking into account the political economy. So say, given my politics, what is it that I'm likely to be able to achieve in 4 years? Within the national development framework and all the other priorities that we have, are there some? And I think if we became much more pragmatic in that way, much more hard-nosed that way, even within the constraints of our policies, we'll be able to make progress. When it comes to fixing the overall politics, you cannot do that within the political cycle as the duty of the government in power. That is for all of us. And those kinds of all of us type of situations, they are really difficult to address. So that's my quick and dirty answer to the very profound question that you raised, Bernard.
Thank you, Bright. I want to take concluding comments from Dr. Cudjoe, if you are there. What are your takeaways from the conversation in relation to the roadmap to our economic transformation?
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I missed some of the conversations, but I think the
please mute.
Can I go on, please?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. So, for me, the key takeaways are essentially, as far as the transformation that we all want is concerned, first and foremost is we can have a common vision because everybody cannot be brought on board, so to speak. But what is important is the need to have a politics which is grounded on some moral compass that guides the political system in terms of what the overall objectives of national development will be. So it won't then matter whether there is a 40 or 100-year development plan. Broadly, we know where we want to go. So once that is fixed, at least in terms of vision formulation, then we will be able to then work towards whatever goals we set ourselves. So it won't necessarily matter if you want to fix all hospitals first, or fix all roads first, or make sure all traffic lights work without ever breaking down. Because if you fix that one, at least you will have sorted one very important problem, which creates other synergies in the wider economy. And so I will stop here, given that we don't really have much time to go on. on this tangent.
Thank you, Professor Odro. What are your concluding thoughts?
Hello, yes. We've been looking here at the roadmap to Ghana's economic transformation, but the discussion has shown that it's the political economy of it all that we need to consider, and that we cannot look at the economics without looking at the politics. But then again, as I had mentioned earlier, as we think of transformation, we also need to look at the distributional dynamics and to make sure that we have an inclusive strategy in terms of space, in terms of income, in terms of gender, and other different features that may emerge, so that we are inclusive and we try as much as possible to be deliberate in our thinking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Texan. Any final thoughts from you?
Okay, Bernard, thank you. I just want to leave this discussion with one very important thing that we should take home. Our economic transformation will require that we get to a point where the growth that we are all yearning for will be a growth that ensures that we've diversified our economy, a growth that will make our exports competitive, a growth that would lead our politicians and the political leadership to invest in productive sectors and make us productive. That would call for investment into education, health, skills training, not just the English type of education, but then technical vocational skills. It should be a growth that will encourage technological upgrading and advancement, and it should be a growth that has a human face, so that whatever we do, we should make sure that it's very inclusive and everybody partakes in that. That is the economic transformation that Ghana needs. Thank you.
Wonderful. Some other speakers we had earlier who went off include Professor Theo or Dr. Theo Champong, who was with us for the better part of the program until internet issues took him off. We also, unfortunately, could not hear from Josephine Bakwan Ponsa. For some reason, her connection did not really work. And we had Professor Jepoma Jachidakun as well, who came in to make a point. Our moderator, Abdul Hayil Mumin, we are still looking for him. We don't know. So if you find him, please let me know. I don't know where he is. I'm going to conclude in two ways. Usually when these discussions, I had 2 hours of discussion. What do you take away? Being a journalist, I want you to remember, so a spoonful of alliteration helps the medicine go down. So I picked 6 key words from the discussion. If you were to play back the discussion and do a keyword search, I think the 6 keywords, some of which I have changed for alliteration purposes, will be: first, the past. History is very important. Colonialism, we have to discuss it, whether it's the length of time or the structure or the impact. New colonialism or whatever form it is, you cannot discuss Ghana's economic transformation without looking at the past. So the first P is the past. The second P is policy. And I think Bright made that point very forcefully when he spoke about the lack of policy debate to refine policy, and the fact that our policy choices are not necessarily data driven. So that the policy is a key thing we must look at. The third P, I think Professor Abena Odro mentions political economy. You can't separate the economic transformation question from the politics and governance question. So if you want a P to remember, is political economy. The fourth P is planning, development planning. Whether it's a 40-year development plan or coordinated program of economic activity, all the countries that have transformed have worked with a plan. So we have to think and talk about plans. That's another key word that came through. Point number 5 was productivity. I bring productivity in under the manufacturing discussion and the value addition discussion. And in fact, productivity is one of the 5 keywords of assets template for economic transformation: diversification, export competitiveness, productivity increases, technology upgrades, and human well-being. They call it growth with depth, and that's Asset's main idea, that growth is not enough. You must diversify, be export competitive, have productivity increase, technology must be upgraded, and human well-being. So our fifth point is productivity. And then the last point is about people, which again, I think Professor Bro talks about inequality, distribution, and the effects of policies on livelihoods. So if you want, if you told somebody on a Twitter discussing economic transformation and they said, what did they say? Tell them they had a discussion around 6 P's: the past, policy, political economy, planning, productivity, and people. I don't know if Mavis can give us when the next space or what the team wants to do next, the compact team. Maybe it's a listener. I wish you'll be made a speaker, because this is such a rich group. If you could let us know, we've had sessions on values, we've had sessions on youth. Is this the last one? Are there any more? Or Charlene, what are the closing announcements before we lose this very illustrious group of people on the audience? So, Charlene, if you are there, or maybe if you can find a way of telling us what next after today's discussion.
Thanks, Bernard. We lost Charlene along the way, trying to get Mavis to join, but we have a series of consultations we'll be doing next. We'll be going around the various parts of the country and do engage citizens in the various conversations. We'll be having another set of Twitter spaces on various subjects that the compact is touching on, and we had already shared a comprehensive plan on how we want to engage citizens and other things. So basically, that's how it's going to be. The various themes that the compact is covering, we'll have Twitter spaces on those ones, and then we will make sure that we have a citizens assembly along the way, that we engage and take the views and perspectives from various citizens. Bernard, over to you.
Thank you very much for being part of this. A recording of the session will be made available for those who missed the initial parts. I want to thank the panel for spending their time with us. Let me just go through the names for one final time. Professor Bernard Dro of the University of Ghana, thank you. Professor Ebo Texan of the University of Ghana, thank you. Professor Jepoma Ajechedako, thank you. Dr. Theo Champon, thank you. Dr. Manokujo, thank you. Bright Simmons, thank you. Josephine Bako and Ponsa, thank you. And Abdul Hayy Mumin for disappearing and leaving me to be both a moderator and a presenter. Thank you for putting
Well,
it together.
I think Mavis is
Yes, Mavis. Okay, so what next, Mavis?
So, good evening, everyone. This has been a very stimulating conversation. Thank you. So, Ben, as Kojo outlined, in terms of next steps, we want to have a conversation on issues like health. Access to jobs. We want to continue. So those are the key themes in the compact. We also want to have a Twitter space conversation on how do we keep this conversation alive? How do we get more Ghanaians to engage in this process over and above Twitter? So some of us can get on Twitter, but connectivity in Ghana is not everywhere. So when we leave these conversations, how do we ensure the 6 P's you've outlined, Ben, does not stay in the Twitter sphere or X sphere, whatever we call it these days, but we have that conversation out and it feeds back into the dialogue. So that is the ambition. So for everybody who's signed in today, echoing what Ben says, thank you. But we really hope that you plan to take these key messages to a much wider audience and feed it back into the discourse in the various discussions happening online, on radio, on TV, and it becomes an everyday conversation. And can I take this opportunity to also say thank you very much, Ben? We really appreciate you stepping up and playing this dual role. You were fantastic as usual.
Thank you. I will see you guys next time. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye and thank you.
Bye.
Destroying generational. Anyway. Cyanide that mercury in the water. They let this poison in the water. The farmlands are chemicalized and I don't know.